You guys seem to really like me doing this challenge in vanilla, and the Calamity Mod just recently had an update adding these ridiculously cute guys to the game. So I figured now was the perfect time to attempt to beat the Calamity Mod using Sentries-Only. And given that Calamity doesn't add a single accessory or armor set that buffs sentries, but does add plenty of bosses even stronger than the Moonlord, this could be my toughest challenge run yet. I'll also be ranking all of the sentries in a tier list based on how unique and useful they are, so stick around to see how your favourite sentry lines up.
I will look for you. I will find you. And I will
buy sentries from
you.
I started the playthrough in the very strange situation of already having my first sentry, the Squire staff. It's such a relief to actually have a weapon at the start of one of these challenge runs, and is a far cry from what Mr. JFL had to do a couple of years ago when he took on this challenge himself. Back then, the only way to progress was to use NPCs to take down the brain of Cthulhu. Thankfully though, we're now living in a more civilised time, so while I grind through some early game progression with the help of the squirrel, why don't I take you through the rules for this challenge? It's actually just one rule really, and that is that the vast majority of my damage has to come from sentries. I've taken your feedback from the vanilla video on board and won't be using things like the honeycomb or slimy saddle to supplement my damage. There may be the occasional hit with a pickaxe or accessory effect, but I want to make it clear that I'll never be picking accessories for this extra damage, and I'll be going out of my way to avoid it entirely in the early game. This challenge is also going to be done in Revengeance mode, once I remember to switch it on that is. With that out of the way, it's already time for our first boss fight. Doing 4 damage every few seconds to a boss with almost 4000 health isn't going to cut it. I need a better weapon, and there's only one possible candidate at this point in progression. Found in a chest at the bottom of the Sulphurous Sea, the Rusty Beacon prototype is a very unique sentry that periodically fires an expanding toxic wave. It has the same base damage as the Squire, and has the benefit of AoE and a powerful debuff, meaning there's not much reason to use the Squirrel Staff anymore. So let's throw it on the tier list before it's retired. It works well when there are no other options, but its damage is too low to last very far into a playthrough, and you'll want to replace it as soon as possible. Due to how easy this sentry is obtained, with it literally being given to new players, I'm going to put it in the D tier. It was time to put our new sentry to the test, as that night I got a message warning of the arrival of the Eye of Cthulhu. I quickly collect some buffs for myself and my arena, and then once it spawns, the Rusty Beacon begins slowly ticking away at his health. I'm using copper armor for the additional 2 flat damage it gives, effectively acting as a 25% boost to the Rusty Beacon. However, the damage over time from the irradiated debuff is really what makes this fight possible, dealing an additional 4 DPS for the majority of the fight. It takes a while, but eventually the Eye is defeated. Now that the Dryad can spawn, I buy some pumpkin seeds from her and wait for these to grow. While they do, I build a basic arena in the desert and craft a sandstorm in a bottle, by which point the pumpkins have grown and I can craft the harvest staff that the Bountiful Harvest update was named after. This staff will spawn a nest that periodically summons pumpkins that seek out and explode on nearby enemies, dealing damage in a small area of effect. While this is undoubtedly the cutest sentry in the game, its damage can be quite inconsistent, so for that reason I'll be placing it in the B tier. With this in hand, I travel back to the desert and spawn the Scourge. I couldn't decide what was better between the Rusty Beacon and the Harvest Staff. The toxic wave from the beacon dealt a small amount of damage to a lot of segments, and the explosion of the little pumpkin guys dealt a high amount of damage to very few segments. Either way, my damage was pretty low, but thankfully the Desert Scourge is a pretty easy enough boss to dodge in the early game, so it soon falls. With the Scourge down, I can now descend into the sunken sea and face off against the giant clam. Defeating the giant clam frees the Sea King, who I buy my next sentry from, the Polyp Launcher. This has a much higher fire rate than the other sentries I've collected so far, which makes it useful in certain situations, but its actual damage is quite low, especially against enemies with higher defense. For this reason, I'm going to place it right below the Harvest Staff in C tier. Believe it or not, there's just one more sentry added by Calamity in pre-hard mode, and we're already able to obtain it. The nuclear toads that spawn during the acid rain have a 5% chance of dropping the caustic croaker staff, but our damage is way too low to take on the actual event legitimately, so instead I repeatedly use the acid rain summon item during the night. This starts the event for a few seconds, just long enough for a handful of enemies to spawn. After doing this enough times, a caustic croaker staff drops, and I can quite honestly say that this might be the worst sentry in the game, for the simple fact that in order for it to attack enemies, it needs to destroy itself, meaning that for this sentry to be useful, you need to constantly use the item, but don't use it too fast, otherwise it won't have enough time to explode. F tier is a sentry. It may have a use as a support weapon for general summoners to deal the irradiated debuff, but I'd honestly just use the rusty beacon for this, as it doesn't need babysitting. With all the Calamity sentries collected, our only upgrades before hard mode can come from vanilla, and for that we'll need to defeat the Eater of Worlds. The rusty beacon prototype does incredibly well against this boss, dealing damage to many segments, while the debuff does constant damage over time. The only issue comes once the worm splits into many smaller ones, which quickly overwhelm me. The additional 2 flat damage from the copper armor wasn't helping much due to the high defense of the boss, so I decided to switch to silver for the additional healing. While mining for this, I am notified of a goblin invasion, so head home to deal with it. Once again, the rusty beacon comes in clutch, with it even being able to take out the purple bolts from goblin sorcerers before they reach the player, making this event a cakewalk. After it's over, I return to mining for silver while looking for the goblin tinkerer. I collect enough silver and craft the armor, but the tinkerer remains elusive, so I chug the only hunter potion I have, and then find him 10 seconds later in my elevator. Even before being freed, the goblin tinkerer still finds a way to waste my resources. I upgrade to Spectre Boots, then quickly take down the King Slime for the solidifier, so I can craft a red balloon to upgrade my double jump. After reforging some of my weapons and accessories, I return to the Eater of Worlds fight, which this time I win, securing the Rusty Beacon prototype as the first S tier sentry of the playthrough. Seriously, this fight would have been near impossible with any of the other sentries available at this stage, and defeating the Eater of Worlds stand as one of the last challenge before a major leap in power level. Unfortunately, the other challenge is the Tavernkeep's obnoxiously low spawn rate, so I distract myself with some other tasks that need done while hoping that he spawns. First comes building a basic cabin in the snow biome so that I have space for more NPCs. Then I craft a nightmare pickaxe and mine up enough obsidian to make a full set of obsidian armour, which gives us the highest possible damage boost all the way up to tier 2 of the Old One's army. Next, I steal a water candle from the dungeon and use it to farm for the Wolfram battery accessory for an additional 7% summon damage. Over the next several hours I do some grinding of fishing quests, shimmering of permanent upgrades, building of houses, and crafting of boots, all while keeping an eye out for the Tavernkeep. Then, while farming for a depth meter, I spot him in the corner of my screen. I claim the 10 free defender medals he offers, then immediately use these to buy a ballista and a lightning aura rod. And after flattening out an arena and reforging my new sentries, I was ready for tier 1 of the Old One's army.
Oh, really? You in what army?
The lightning auras took care of the weaker enemies while the ballistas shot down the stronger ones, and before long the Old One's army is defeated. This marks what is perhaps the most significant rise in power level in the playthrough, with the war table and Squire shield more than tripling our damage. On top of that, I can now use the Old One's army sentries outside of the event, so let's put them all on the tier list. Note that I'll only be putting these on once, as the tier 2 and 3 variants work almost exactly the same as the rods from tier 1, and would likely just go in the same tiers anyway. The explosive trap is only slightly more usable as a sentry than the caustic croaker staff, so it just barely scrapes into E tier. The flame burst towers have a decent fire rate, but lack the power needed to get anywhere higher than D tier. As for the lightning aura sentries, these aren't great against bosses, but make up for it when used against events, specifically the Old One's army itself, securing it a place in the C tier. The ballistas are perhaps the only one I'd consider using against bosses. The high damage and ability to pierce make this a great weapon when the ballista shots actually hit. But that's just the problem, as most of the time these projectiles are too slow against fast moving bosses, placing ballistas in the B tier. With all the relevant pre-hard mode sentries collected, it's time for some actual progression. First up, the Hive Mind. Thanks to how slowly this boss moves, the ballistas actually work really well here. Next, Skeletron, who after a few deaths I finally come to a working strategy using the Harvest Staff. Crabulon is next, solely for the permanent rage upgrade he drops. The Polyp Launcher was the sentry of choice for this fight, being able to deal damage rapidly to the crab's large hitbox. Lastly, the Slime God. The high fire rate of the Polyp Launcher ended up being the most consistent option again, being able to take down the smaller slimes summoned by the boss before they became too much of an issue. With these bosses out of the way, I was ready to take on the final boss of pre-hard mode, and without a doubt the hardest one so far. The wall was proving to be quite the challenge. I had settled on using the Rusty Beacon prototype, as it could float and attack through blocks, making it much easier to use than my other options. This meant that I could focus on dodging the boss without thinking too much about sentry placement. It also mows through the hungry like nothing else, which is both a blessing and a curse, as I had to continuously be aware of them breaking off from the wall and damaging me. Sure, the ballista would have dealt more damage, but it would also require a lot more concentration and terrain prep that I really couldn't be bothered with. So after smashing my head against the wall a few times, I finally beat it, marking the end of pre-hard mode and the start of a new chapter on our adventure.
Well, thank you. We'll just go.
Go? I think not.
With the beginning of hard mode comes a new sentry, the Queen Spider Staff. I very carefully farmed some fangs in the caverns and then craft it. Unfortunately, this is the only sentry we'll be able to obtain before defeating at least one hard mode boss, of which there are a couple of options. We could decide to fight the Aquatic Scourge and then take on the subsequent Tier 2 Acid Rain event for the Orthus Era shell. But a much better idea is to take down any one of the mechs for access to all of the Tier 2 Old One's army sentries, along with the armour sets that come with it. To do that though, we're going to need a lot of upgrades, starting with the Amalgamated Brain. This incredibly powerful accessory takes the Brain of Confusion and slaps on an additional 10% damage boost. Next up is a new set of wings, so I spend some time in the Hallowed grinding out pixie dust, then take down some wyverns for the souls of flight needed to craft the fairy wings. To match these, I also craft a pair of fairy boots, which Calamity changes to spawn fairies that give additional regen, defense, and movement speed when nearby. I then grind through the Old One's army a few times to gather a decent supply of defender medals, after which it was time for my first attempt against a mech boss, and I was humbled to say the least. After a few attempts, it was clear to me that my damage output wasn't high enough. So I added an additional layer of platforms higher up so that the nests could hit the upper arms and head while the spiders take down the lower hands. This worked much better, and I actually managed to get all the hands down within a decent time frame, but over the next few minutes of night I barely dealt any damage to the head, and died at 130 with 23,000 health remaining. Engaging just one of my 2 remaining brain cells, I spent the entire next day filling my arena with walls so that the spiders would be able to climb towards the head. I'm not sure why I didn't do this in my vanilla Sentries-Only run, as it's sure to make the Queen Spider Staff deal a ton of extra damage. Oh, that's why. Feeling a little embarrassed by this mistake, I spend the next day collecting life fruits in the jungle, turning one of them into an Aegis fruit for the additional defense, and eating the rest for extra health. After fully topping this up, I spawn Skeletron Prime once again and end up somehow doing worse, dying earlier than before and with more of the boss's health left. The next night I decided to try my luck against the Destroyer instead, and while my damage against the boss was pretty good, I had no defense against the probes and the sheer amount of lasers eventually overwhelmed me. In the daytime I take a break from the mechs and give Plan B a try, but as you might have guessed from my tone, this didn't go well either. My stubbornness was telling me to stick with Skeletron Prime as it was the fight I was doing best in, but not without a few changes. I built a few more houses and brewed a little Fab Sol's vodka so that the drunk princess would move in, then I buy some arena buff candles from her which will increase my damage, defense, movement speed and regen. Not by much, but hopefully enough to make a difference. I also buy the Rod of Discord from the wizard, a trade added by Calamity that negates quite a lot of grinding. I then took down the Queen Slime to get the gelatinous pillion mount, thinking I could use this for movement while focusing my accessories on damage. It's only after doing this that I realised the Calamity devs nerfed its horizontal speed so much that it's practically useless, so I was stuck with my boots and wings. Despite this, I push on and summon Skeletron Prime once again, this time making sure to lead him close to the ground in his spinning phase to rack up some extra damage from the spiders. This on top of the arena buffs and Fab Sol's vodka helped me out just enough damage wise that with only 20 seconds of night remaining, Skeletron Prime falls, unlocking the next tier of the Old One's army and the rest of hard mode.
I got plenty of friends. I can name 3 right off the bat. The gang's all here.
Now that new items are available from the Tavernkeep shop, I buy the Ballista and Lightning Auracanes, then get started on the Tier 2 Old One's army. While the Ethereal Goblins get decimated in the background, now is a good time to add the Queen Spider Staff to the tier list. Now while this may be the best and technically only option for the pre-boss stage of hard mode, I definitely can't say it's good. The fact that you have to stay so close to the ground in order for the spiders to do any damage is a major detractor, meaning I can't place this any higher than D tier. We're in the final wave now, and after taking down the first ogre so quickly, a second one ended up spawning. I managed to take both down before they reached the crystal, and claim victory over the tier 2 Old One's army. This gives me just enough defender medals to buy the Squires helm and plating, but in order to get the greaves I had to take down the event one more time. While it may give 1% less summon damage than the obsidian armour I've been wearing, the full set takes our max number of sentries from 3 to 5, essentially acting as a 67% damage increase. On top of this, it's also a huge upgrade to our defense, movement speed, and health regen. With all these power boosts, I am more than ready for the next few bosses in progression, so let's get started. First, I travel to the Sulphurous Sea to take out the Aquatic Scourge, granting me access to the Tier 2 Acid Rain event and the Orthocera staff that comes with it. Then at night, my ballistas pierce through the destroyer and my Orthoceras shoot down the twins. I open all 3 mech bags now that they've all been defeated, so that I actually get hallowed bars from them, then use these along with the souls they drop to upgrade my spirit glyph to a hallowed rune, which gives buffs to regen, defense, and summon damage when minions hit enemies, which also works with most sentries. The next boss on my hit list is Cryogen. This fight solidified the Orthocera shell as perhaps the most balanced sentry added by Calamity. It's a pretty straightforward weapon, being just a floating sentry that fires shots at nearby enemies, but it just works. It's not overpowered or underpowered like most other sentries added by the mod, perfectly riding the line of usability, earning it a slot in the B for balance tier. Leaning slightly more into the potentially too strong tier is the next weapon we get. Purchased from the Archmage after defeating all 3 mechanical bosses, the Cryogenic Staff shoots bouncing ice bolts at nearby enemies. After targeting the same enemy for some time, it will also charge up a secondary attack that fills the screen with gravity-affected icicles, damaging any enemies they hit. The fast projectile speed and fire rate, along with the pure chaos that is the secondary attack, earns this a place in the A tier, and it sees no problem in taking down both the Calamitas clone and Plantera. After which I descend into the dungeon to open the frozen chest for the Staff of the Frost Hydra. After getting to know the Cryogenic Staff over the last couple of bosses, I can't help but feel this is a bit of a downgrade. It's perfectly viable, but nothing special. C tier. After farming up enough Starblight Suit, the new name for Stardust, I craft the summon for Astrum Aureus and begin the fight against him. These slower moving bosses perfectly showcase the strengths of the Sentry subclass, and the Cryogenic Staff specifically. Before long, Aureus is defeated, meaning it's time to head into the underground astral biome to farm our next, and perhaps my most favourite, Sentry.
I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you! Come on!
Now I'm not entirely sure who was in charge of balancing the Hive pod, but I'd like to thank them for doing such a bad job. This thing does about 3 to 4 times the DPS of my next best option against single targets, making it a potentially larger power boost than each tier of the Old One's army, which is rather insane given the event holds practically every relevant armour and accessory for the Sentry subclass. Straight to S tier, and you'll see why throughout the following section. The Hive pod easily takes down the Leviathan and Anahita, unlocking access to Depth Cells and Luminal in the Abyss. After collecting enough of these, I craft the Dreadmine Staff, which would be a disappointment even if it wasn't for the Hive pod being available at the same point in progression. This sentry essentially acts as the Spore Sack but in weapon form, generating mines near blocks that slowly home in on nearby enemies. You would think a weapon with this speed that needs to be placed near blocks would have high damage to compensate, but no, its damage is worse than many pre-Plantera options, dealing around 600 to 700 DPS compared to the Hive pod's 2,500. I'll be placing it in E tier, and it can thank me for being so kind. Before moving on to Golem, I farmed the Old One's army a few times to gather more Defender medals and banners to make the final tier a little easier. After which I make my way through the Jungle Temple and build a small arena for Golem. If you watched my last Calamity video where I attempted to collect every dagger, then you'll know that I struggled against this boss, and it's no different here. My damage was good, but my dodging wasn't, which led to me dying on the first attempt. Thankfully the second went much better, and after collecting my treasure I get a little over enthusiastic and start the final tier of the Old One's army without upgrading to the final tier of Sentries. With the help of my Hive pods this doesn't matter though, and I make it to the final wave with barely a scratch on the Eternia crystal. I reposition the Hives to take out Betsy while the ballistas take care of the ground enemies, and after a short battle with her, Betsy is defeated. I get lucky enough to have her wings drop from the treasure bag, and given the significance of the Old One's army in this playthrough, it only made sense to use these for the rest of hard mode. From the Tavernkeep, I buy a full set of Valhalla armour and the final tier of ballista, but found that even with the ballista panic buff, the Hive pods still dealt more damage, which with the additional 6th sentry and extra damage from the Valhalla set, now dealt around 3600 damage per second. With numbers like that, I had no trouble taking down the Ravager a couple of times to obtain the Spikecrag staff, the next sentry in progression. When placed near a target dummy, it deals an admirable 2000 DPS, however when placed right on top of one, this rockets up to over 12,000. Against more stationary enemies like Golem or the Ravager itself, this would be an incredibly powerful weapon. However, there aren't really any of those bosses left in hard mode, and against faster enemies most of the spikes miss, so the Hive pod remains my strongest weapon and I'll be placing the Spikecrag staff in C tier. Next up is the Plaguebringer Goliath, so I clear out the central island from my Plantera arena and spawn the boss. The first attempt ends pretty quickly with my death, but on the second I come out on top and use the infected armour plating she drops to craft the Pulse Turret Remote, the last sentry of hard mode. This sentry is quite unique in that it requires charge to work and only one can exist at a time. When placed it shoots a spread of 3 lasers that converge on an enemy and pierce once, coming back around to hit the same target again. Its DPS hovers around 600, which is comparable to the Hive pods, but given the fact that only one of these can exist, I'll be placing it in C tier. With the last sentry collected, it was time to end hard mode, so I travel to the dungeon to take out the cultists with my shield dash. Now before I get any comments telling me that my Asgar's Valor isn't a sentry, I know, but there's no way for me to target my sentries to neutral enemies, so I'm working with what I have. The cultist fight is pretty uneventful, as are the pillars. These are one of the few situations where sentries might actually be better than most other subclasses. With so many of them dealing damage to nearby enemies, I can just focus on dodging the few that get through to me. I'm also lucky enough to not suffer from the criminally low defense that usually plagues the summoner class, so even if I do take a hit, it's not the end of the world. With the pillars down I craft some super healing potions and await the arrival of the Moonlord. This first attempt was pretty messy. I needed to stay relatively close to my sentries for them to deal damage, so I ended up getting hit for a lot of damage way too often. To help mitigate this, I reforged some of my accessories to warding and resummoned the Moonlord, this time trying out the Spikecrag staff. I found the damage was a bit too inconsistent, so stuck with the Hive pod for the rest of the fight. Thanks to my slightly tankier build, I could absorb more hits from the Moonlord's many projectiles while my sentries took down the eyes. Once his core was revealed, I found that the Moonclots would often get to the Moonlord, healing him. Thankfully though, my damage was high enough to overcome this, and the Moonlord was defeated.
That's the endgame. How are you guys planning on beating that?
Together.
We'll lose.
And we'll do that together too.
From the Moonlord's treasure bag I was able to get both the Lunar Portal and Rainbow Crystal Staff, the final 2 vanilla sentries. The infinite pierce of the Lunar Portal staff makes it incredibly useful for events, and even against some later bosses with many segments. For this, I'll be placing it in the A tier. As for the Rainbow Crystal Staff, it deals very good damage against single targets, but its range is somewhat low, so B tier it is. I craft the Celestial Tracers and get straight to work on an arena in Hell for Providence. While doing so, an impious Immolator drops the Sanctified Spark, a sentry weapon that fires homing profane dust at nearby enemies. The large range and homing aspect is nice, but it's beaten out by the Rainbow Crystal Staff for damage, so this will be added just below it in C tier. After another half hour of digging, I finished the arena and spawned the Profaned Guardians. The lunar portal manages to shoot straight through the protective circle of rocks spawned by the Guardians to hit the bosses themselves, making this a reasonably fast fight. I spawned Providence right after and quickly regret it, so I spent some time collecting the components for the Sponge and Ambrosial Ampule, two accessories that should increase my survivability against the boss. For some reason this increase doesn't kick in on the first try, but on the second it does, and I come out on top. Now that Providence is defeated, the Skrullar enemies in the Brimstone Crags will drop the Guidelight of Oblivion, a sentry which acts much like the Dreadmine Staff, but good. Like it, this sentry will also spawn projectiles over time that home in on nearby enemies, but it doesn't need to be near blocks and the projectiles home much faster. This is a perfectly usable sentry that would be more than powerful enough for the next few bosses, but since there are more powerful options available, I'm going to put it in the C tier. With no other possible upgrades, I get straight into a fight with the Stormweaver, which he wins. But it's fine because we draw on the next one, which is really a win for me since I'm immortal. So after respawning I returned for the treasure bag and collect the armour plating within. Lucky for me it was raining, as my next weapon was going to require a Nimbus Rod dropped by the angry rain clouds. One drops pretty quickly and I combine this with the armoured plating and an Aqua Scepter I'd been keeping safe since pre-hard mode to craft Aqua Scepter. You heard that right. The Aqua Scepter is used to craft a weapon called Aqua Scepter. This sentry acts as a beefed up Nimbus Rod, featuring rain that damages enemies below, and a Tesla aura that strikes down enemies that get too close. It's a very unique weapon that has a lot of potential when used correctly, so I'll be placing this in A tier. Unfortunately there aren't any more sentries available until I defeat the Old Duke, which is a fight I'm absolutely terrible at, so I'm going to want every possible advantage I can get my hands on. Find the Lost Archive. Set up Arena. Get killed by Ceaseless. Kill Cygnus. Get revenge on Ceaseless, featuring Aqua Scepter. Defeat Poltergast. Consume Ectoheart for adrenaline boost. Craft the Phantomic Artifact. Die to the Old Duke. Die to the Old Duke. Die to the Old Duke. Have an epiphany. What if, instead of fighting the Old Duke for the 1 in 3 chance I get the drop I want, I quickly skip to the Devourer of Gods, get some upgrades, and return to the Old Duke, stronger than before. Die to the Devourer of Gods, 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 die to the Devourer of Gods. This is where the playthrough takes a turn. Up until now, everything felt like a fairly reasonable challenge. I'd stopped the Wall of Flesh with the pre-boss weapon, defeated Skeletron Prime using some spiders, and made my way through all these bosses to the final 5. But the Devourer of Gods and Old Duke felt like such insurmountable obstacles that I wasn't sure it would be possible to complete this challenge. My motivation was at an all-time low, so I decided to load up YouTube and listen to Universal Collapse, the theme for the Devourer of Gods. You see, when I make these videos, I have to play with music disabled, otherwise I wouldn't be able to add my own in the edit, and I think I'm really missing out on more than just some ambience by doing that. Maybe the final boost I needed wasn't to my damage, defense or mobility, but to myself. After 64 long attempts, the Devourer was defeated. Using a vanilla weapon dropped by the Moonlord, I might add. I can now work on gaining some significant upgrades before looping back around to the old Duke, but first I'll need to quickly take down the moon events. Well, that was easy. I start by making the Occult Skull Crown for a boost to both Rage and Adrenaline. Then craft the Cosmic Anvil needed to make the rest of the items. Those being the Asgardian Aegis, Chalice of the Blood God, the Sponge, the Amalgam, Omega Healing Potions, and after a quick fight with Hallowed Providence, the Elysian Tracers. I want to take a second to appreciate how much I love this post-Devourer stage. It feels entirely unique to all other stages of the game, with the sheer amount of upgrade options available, and really sells the idea that you're gearing up for the final bosses of the playthrough. With that being said, it's time to hunker down and settle in for some Old Duke attempts. As the attempts racked up, I slowly got better with the Old Duke's attack pattern, but the real change came when I decided to pivot from damaging accessories to defensive ones, going so far as to remove the Squire shield I'd been wearing since pre-hard mode. This boost to survivability seemed to be exactly what I needed, as on the next attempt I took down the Old Duke and crossed my fingers as I opened his treasure bag, hoping to receive the cadaverous Carrion Sentry. And I did! After so many failed attempts, it was honestly such a relief to obtain this from the first treasure bag. At a 33% chance it could have easily taken a lot more, but thankfully I am now the proud owner of not one, but 6 decapitated Old Dukes, adding up to a whopping 40,000 damage per second against a single target. And this isn't even a particularly optimised build for damage. This is by far my best option for the remainder of the playthrough, but there are some pretty tough bosses left to take down. So let's see how it does against Yaren. After over 120 combined attempts against the Devourer of Gods and Old Duke, something unexpected happened when fighting Yaren. I was actually having fun in this playthrough again. While it may have limited range and be unable to target enemies below it, the Old Duke heads dealt very respectable damage to Yaren. They required a little babysitting to retarget onto him after each teleport, but being limited to Sentries-Only was in no way a detractor from my enjoyment of this fight. In fact, I think it made me enjoy it even more. If I was ranking the Cadaverous Carrion based on this boss alone, I'd probably put it in S tier, but there's still 2 more bosses it'll have to go up against. Before that though, I take to the caverns to mine up the aura core that magically appears there after defeating Yaren. I then use it to craft some Seraph Tracers, and return to mine enough for anything I'd want to use auric bars for. Included in that is the Radiance accessory, which requires a short detour to kill King Slime and Astrum Aureus before it can be crafted. I then teleport to my main arena at the Sulphurous Sea and get ready for my first attempt against the Exo Mechs. The first phase against Artemis and Apollo goes surprisingly well. My sentries deal good damage, and the projectiles are definitely possible to dodge without moving too far from where my sentries are placed. The issues crop up straight after this when Ares and Thanatos arrive. With the sheer amount of projectiles from these 2 bosses, staying in one place is a death sentence. On my second attempt I chose to fight Ares first, and again the first phase was not too bad. In the second phase I noticed what the real issue was though. Thanatos was absorbing pretty much all of my damage with his massive damage reduction, so each phase with him in it was going to last much longer than I could. After another 3 attempts without getting any closer, I decided to give Supreme Calamitas a try instead, and to my surprise, this happened. That's right, I somehow managed to beat Supreme Calamitas on my first try while using Sentries-Only, and it was the last time I had fun in this playthrough. I tried everything, using Fearmonger armour for extra defense, using Auric Tesla armour for the many set bonuses, using a mix of Valhalla and Fearmonger for a balance between defense and offense, using the Squires shield, Rampart of Deities, Bloodflare core, every combination I could think of, but I still couldn't get any further than the second phase. I tried Artemis and Apollo first, Thanatos first. Oh look, I got to the third phase on that one, but died pretty soon after. Nothing seemed to be working. The further I got into the fight, the less feasible it seemed. I was beginning to wonder if this fight would even be possible using Sentries-Only. Sure, Mr. JFL did it 2 years ago, but he's using a weapon that isn't even classified as a sentry anymore. That's when I saw this video. This absolutely insane video by a channel with just 3 subscribers and 173 no-hits, showing that not only is it possible to defeat the Exo-Mechs with Sentries-Only, it's also possible to do it without getting hit. I left a comment signifying my renewed sense of resolve to complete this challenge and returned to the game to push on. The video didn't just show me that the fight was possible, it also laid out an exact blueprint for how to do it. I'd been thinking about sentries wrong this whole playthrough. They weren't summon weapons, they were magic ones. And once I started treating them like this, I began improving with each fight, slowly refining my strategy with each loss and settling on an eventual path to success. Spawn Ares. Move left to avoid plasma blasts. Move right to avoid Tesla chain. Reposition to the left. Dash right to avoid laser. Move left to avoid plasma blasts. Move right and upwards to avoid Tesla chain and Gauss nuke. Die. Try again. Fall down as the next phase begins. Start running to the left immediately, placing sentries to attack Artemis. Use verticality to avoid getting hit. Die. Try again. Use a combination of adrenaline and rage to quickly get through this phase. Once Ares returns, target him and run left on the platform. Dash or jump occasionally to avoid projectiles, most of them can't hit you. Die, and try again. Once on his own, finish off Ares and move on to Thanatos. Repeatedly place Aqua's Scepter to deal damage to the many segments of Thanatos. Only a few can be damaged at a time, so a single target weapon will not work here. Die. Try again. Farm up Rage and Adrenaline. When Artemis and Apollo return, use this on them while moving to the right. Once they're on their own, take them down while trying not to get hit. Die. Try again. When Thanatos returns, hope and pray. I could never quite get the hang of Thanatos' last phase. Perhaps it's just because this is the one I got the least practice with, or perhaps it's just a more chaotic section of the fight. One thing's for sure, and that's that my damage against him wasn't high. Most of it had to come during the laser phase using the Cadaverous Carrion, but since this could only shoot upwards, it would often be blocked by the rest of Thanatos' body, making this phase of the fight take an annoyingly long time. Thank... After 242 attempts, I finally managed to survive the last phase long enough to claim victory over the Exo Mechs, collecting the final sentry in the form of the Atlas munitions beacon. But before we take a look at that, let's throw the cadaverous carrion onto the tier list. While it may have some peculiar rules, such as only shooting upwards and the bizarre targeting behaviour, it got me through the endgame, and secures itself a place in the A tier. As for the Atlas munitions beacon, this is a very unique weapon that doesn't actually use up any sentry slots, but summons a single turret from the sky that can be picked up and used by the player. It comes with an overheating mechanic that means you need to frequently take breaks with it, and is overall very enjoyable to use. The only issue is that there currently isn't much to use it against, so it'll be going in the B tier for now. But there was one more thing to use it against, for there was still one more sentry to collect. F tier.